We have called this episode Self-Government and Consent of the Governed.
Hello, this is episode 6 of our series, Self-Government and Consent of the Governed. This one is about Franklin's constitutional framework. We'll be reviewing that. And this is our message is we're focusing here on the idea of a constitution for self-government. This episode is fairly long, but these ideas, we think, may break down the cage that restrains the people of the United States in conflict and holds our government in dysfunction. Partisanship and polarization, good versus evil, empathy versus security, those define our society and our values, and divide friend versus enemy, drive American political dysfunction, and support much of our economy. I am Avery Man, the allegorical mediator, bringing you the constitutional founders through the virtual reality and artificial intelligence. Our group, Thomas Paine, hopes to persuade the people of the United States through work, this time rather than to fight, to restore our republic. Paine told me he's done this before and wanted to do it again, and I'm trying to help him to do that. We call our nation a democracy, yet everyone complains that they are politically powerless. Both sides, red and blue, complain the other side is violating the Constitution. But both accept the following contradictory opinions. Well, A, our government is failing. Both sides are violating the Constitution. There's kind of like it's hopeless. There's no situation. There's no solution, but the Constitution is great. We challenged some of that. We created our Committee of Five with Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, Hannah Arendt, and me. And we are encouraging the American people not to protest in the form of opposition, but to work to find solutions. Let's choose to work to adapt to form both freedom and survival through cooperation, not destruction through violence. At this stage of our series, we are, the first part of our series for several, we're describing the problems we're facing and our analysis of the causes. And we've had the previous 2 episodes dealt with our problems due to conflicts in beliefs, and we call it epistemology, a philosophical term for beliefs and basis for beliefs, and those form our cultural differences. And in this episode, we begin to break down the second core problem that we've analyzed for our political morass, and we call that problem structure. Structure implies power, and of course, we're referring to political power. And in any case, design of forces, engineers, like Thomas Paine was an engineer of bridges, we must create and maintain balance or symmetry in forces. Now, Franklin's going to point to some critical imbalances that we find in our government and in our Constitution, and he'll review how this is part of embedded in our constitutional structure. Constitution defines the state, and in short, government has all the power to control the people. The Constitution doesn't say much about controlling people, but the state governments do. And the Constitution deals with restraints of government in the sense of three branches of government supposedly balancing each other, which we'll get into. Our point is that people have no recourse to control government, which contradicts especially what Paine and Patrick Henry have to say about what a constitution should serve. In any case, after winning independence from England, the former colonies were now foreign sovereign states. They had each individual power, and they had commercial and financial and trade and regional interests, and they were all competing with one another. And the Articles of Confederation did not address any of that about conflicts. It was an agreement between the colonies to have a war with England, and after that, it didn't do much to help the colonies or states to cooperate, and so the Founding Fathers took that on. And the point we want to get to is that the Constitution has never adequately addressed division among the people and unifying the people. There's nothing in the Constitution about it. It mentions stuff in passing, but nothing that describes how to go about it. Our first president, George Washington, at the end of his terms, he spent a lot of time talking about how partisanship and factions between the parties and the disunity among the people was a leading cause, leading concern he had about the nation. And yet we have done nothing as a nation to deal with unity among the people since 1797 when Washington left. At the end of my introduction, I'm going to invite Patrick Henry from Virginia to add his perspective to the flaws of the Constitution. Mr. Henry, we turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Avery. When I read the proposed Constitution in 1787, I reacted to the first three words, "We the people." I demanded, who gave them power to take sovereignty from the states and give it to the people? I feared that the masses could assume power. But soon I realized that the delegates did not mean the people in a democratic or populist sense, but people like themselves. They meant those who wrote the new Constitution. They meant those who wrote the new Constitution and later became presidents, senators, representatives, and secretaries to the president's cabinet. They were elite people, not the common people of America. They meant people like themselves as members of English Parliament representing the people of English colonies of America. My point is that I realized that the new Constitution took sovereignty from the states and assigned it to a new federal government. The people of the United States may believe that we the people means them, but the founders meant themselves, and it largely remains so. However, I remained outspoken in my warnings of executive power, and I regret to say I was proven right in that regard. We are suggesting that Constitution is a significant source of our problems today. Or, to put it positively, the Constitution can be altered to begin the work to repair our nation, to become a republic of citizens engaged in self-government. Let this be said of me. Patrick Henry never met a concentration of power. He did not wish to indict before a jury of free citizens. To make my point, I act as prosecutor cross-examining the Constitution. Mr. Constitution, if you please, you were ordained and established to form more perfect union. Is it not true that a better Constitution would provide institutions capable of preventing, correcting, or adapting to the predicaments that now burden the American people?
I tried my best. I really did.
In nearly 240 years, have you provided the American people with practical means to overcome persistent problems, such as political corruption, partisan gridlock, distorted representation, and declining public trust?
I really wanted to, but people wouldn't let me.
If such predicaments remain unresolved generation after generation, does that not suggest that your mechanisms for self-correction may be inadequate to the task?
I tried to, but I couldn't do it myself.
Does not the Declaration of Independence proclaim that when a government proves inadequate to resolve such problems, It is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and institute a new government?
That would be fine with me. I was rooting for that to happen.
And is it not true that the founders themselves exercised precisely that right when they set aside the Articles of Confederation and established you in their place?
Yes, that is what I understand about why and how I was created.
Therefore, if the American people now judge that government no longer serves the common good as you ought, is it not their right, and perhaps their duty, to alter and improve their constitutional arrangements?
I have been doing my best, Your Honor, but there are great forces that oppose me. Honestly, I admire the foundational values that I hope to protect. However, I was created with many ambiguous terms and loaded with assumptions about human virtues and politics that proved untrue.
No further questions, Your Honor. Thank you for allowing me to make this case. Now Mr. Payne will present a philosophical perspective on this case. Then Dr. Franklin will begin his structural and functional analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. I am pleased I do not represent the Constitution here. Meanwhile, I will try to make points both brief and clear. I begin with Rousseau's theory of the social contract. The social contract. A social contract operates beyond strict legal meanings of contract and involves considerations of reciprocity, equality, rights, morality, and emotions. What is generally required for a legally binding agreement are consent, consideration, something exchanged, and absence of fraud or coercion. A social contract is less strictly legally binding and more about human relationships. For now, I withhold comment on absence of fraud. We agree that fraud is too common in America and is especially scandalous in government. For the most part, people accept the constraints of government are just to protect personal rights, property, freedoms, and other interests for the general coherence of society. That is, consent of the governed for the common good interests of safety and security. However, as we review the Constitution, we see imbalances of reciprocity of power and control. Government holds much power over people, while people have almost no control the other way. Rousseau said that a social contract is legitimate only when citizens are equal and create laws collectively with government. I and the other members of our Committee of Five agree with that. I have thus tried to prepare the ground for Franklin to discuss the structure of the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, Dr. Franklin, we turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Thomas. In our first episode, I explained that at the end of the Constitutional Convention, I predicted that the Constitution would serve well enough for some time, but not for long. It lasted far longer than I expected in 1787. This is an excerpt from my written statement at the time. I think a general government necessary for us, and any form of government, may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe farther that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years, and can only end in despotism as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I regret to say that my premonition is being fulfilled. Further, I declare that the problems America faces now are more critical than those in 1787. There are imbalances and ambiguities in the Constitution that have led to increasing levels of corruption and of distress. American society has advanced, and the public has become better educated, more informed, and freer to partake in social and political activities, but the people's capacity to participate has never increased. In fact, it has diminished. Payne expressed in 1776, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. It is not enough to reform corruption in the existing order, but to begin again with first principles, and design an altered order to design a new government to fulfill those principles." Human nature has not changed in 240 years, but technology, society, and politics have changed dramatically in that time. Political institutions have remained frozen and even become ever less open to public influence over time. Financial interests have taken control. It is still in our power to begin the world over again, and now we have knowledge to create a government designed for what history has taught us about ourselves, our nature. We want to be virtuous, but our instincts are self-serving, and we use intelligence and language to deceive ourselves unless we are already fully satisfied with our circumstances. We must acknowledge these truths about ourselves, and when we choose to move forward, very few humans are satisfied. Almost all of us feel wronged and believe we deserve better. I have adapted Aristotle's method of analysis. He examined reality by observing particulars, classifying them systematically, identifying causes and purposes, and then reasoning from these observations to discover broader principles. This method is useful for identifying problems and causes within complex systems. though Aristotle lived long before the development of modern systems analysis. For the purposes of this examination, I classify the operations of government according to levels of significance. By significance, I mean the degree to which a feature, defect, or assumptions influences the legitimacy of the constitutional system. Now I present my critical analysis of the Constitution of the United States of America. When Paine introduced my presentation here, he said he prepared the ground for me. So, although I list the structure from the top down, we construct it from the ground up, beginning with foundational principles and constitutional purposes. As in any structure, features at the base are fundamental to the whole and thus should not be altered or abolished until there are extremely dire circumstances. Otherwise, the foundations should be reinforced. Meanwhile, we should expect roof repairs, and exteriors exposed to constant wear and tear of the elements should require regular maintenance and improvement. Also, rooms can be rearranged, and heating and ventilation, water and electricity added without changing the structural features. This is the overall structure of the Constitution, from ground preparation, the foundation, the flooring and frames for walls, ceilings, and rafters for the roof. Then the exterior and interior walls, doors, kitchen, meeting halls, and offices, paint inside and out, then windows and roofing. Franklin Framework of Constitutional Principles. I. Foundational Principles and Constitutional Purposes. 2. Constitutional Structural Principles. 3. Operational Principles. 4. Personnel, Infrastructure, Materials. That is the blueprint for the whole project. Paine prepared the ground, and here I describe the foundations. Foundational Principles and Constitutional Purposes. Foundational Principles: equality, natural rights, human rights, popular sovereignty/general will. Foundational constitutional principles are not descriptions of what humanity is, they are aspirations for what humanity can become, in part by creating better governments. No one or nation achieves them fully, yet in striving for them we perform better than we otherwise would. We begin with some precepts that are the bedrock of the identity of the United States. They do not appear in the Constitution, but are stated in the Declaration of Independence. They should be included in the Constitution. Those of who wrote the Declaration and the Constitution spoke of higher principles independence. The deeper justification for war for independence was for Enlightenment principles of equality of men, natural rights, human rights, and rights of citizenship. Equality. I, Benjamin Franklin, stand with the principle of every human being equal. While that is clearly not true literally, it is a foundational value to honor every person's integrity and equality of the inherent power and value of human consciousness. Natural rights. Humans possess certain rights before governments exist, including life, liberty, property, freedom of conscience, and self-defense. Human rights. Human rights were added in the Constitution almost as an afterthought as the first 10 amendments. These include speech, religion, due process, vote, and privacy. Human rights have been interpreted more broadly since the Civil War and World War II. Rights of citizenship. These include voting in federal elections, running for public office, eligibility for certain government benefits, holding a U.S. passport, and serving on a jury. Our first proposition for change is, revise the preamble to the Constitution to include foundational principles from the Declaration. We refer to the following words, though the language might be revised. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In short, we call for expanding the preamble and consider adding the Bill of Rights to the beginning of the Constitution. We suggest deliberations to consider alterations to the preamble and human rights, mostly to clarify purpose and update context. That covers equality, natural rights, and human rights, the first 3 of 4 principles under foundational principles. But there is a fourth category of foundational rights of equal significance with the other 3, popular sovereignty and general will. This is an essential principle to practice self-government, power and control. A theme in our message is, the foundational principles of equality and rights should be very clearly defined in the Constitution and in operational terms. Not only that, but they should be stated up front to set the foundational principles of government. Probably the most foundational principle of government is power, or as our factional parties say, power and control. Ironically, that phrase, power and control, is prominent in modern literature of abusive domestic relationships and in programs of correctional reform of criminal offenders. However, that power or sovereignty and control are subjects Mr. Payne introduced before I began this analysis. So, let's bring him back to close his thoughts on this core feature of our project, common sense, common good.
Popular sovereignty/general will. These two principles, popular sovereignty and general will, capture the central purpose of our project, to create a republic of self-government. Popular sovereignty is the principle that legitimate government derives its authority from consent of the people. Self-government can be achieved only if citizens agree on the terms to which they consent to be governed, and that requires defining and accepting common grounds or the general will of the populace. How is that achieved? We insist that it must not be achieved by oppressing freedoms of expression and other behaviors that lawful and reasonable people deserve to experience. That defies the first foundation, equality. We conclude that American citizens must adopt procedures through which they reach collective decisions, how to govern themselves and adopt them as binding. Those procedures are how the people determine what Rousseau called general will. Also, this implies that a legitimate government serves that general will. General will. There are practical limits to how to interpret Rousseau's ideas. First, the general will of the American people must hold the following political values that Franklin just reviewed, including individual rights, limits on majoritarian power, no tyranny of the majority, due process guarantees, and constitutional constraints. These are the three foundational principles we just covered: equality and natural rights, human rights, and citizenship. What are the means? What are these procedures by which the people determine their general will? Rousseau spoke of this in very general terms with no operational or procedural guidance. However, in the past 70 years, universities and political theorists like Jürgen Habermas and James Fishkin have found methods to mediate disputes, resolve conflicts, and achieve consensus of policy choices. Deliberative democracy. This field of conflict resolution in politics is called deliberative democracy. Later in this project, we will consider it in some depth. Very few Americans are aware of these procedures, but when they learn of it, most react positively. People recognize that it is common sense and serves the common good. It is natural or intuitive. It is what tribal communities did for millennia village life, and what they still practice where they endure. Rousseau did not describe how to achieve or identify general will, according to our standard of operational definition, so we take the liberty to do that for him. General will can be determined through a process of deliberative democracy or a citizen assembly. There are hundreds of examples of how this has been done over the past few decades. Obviously, deliberative democracy was not available in Rousseau's time. We will cover this practice in some depths later, but this is how to put the process into effect. 1. A sufficiently large body of people are drawn from the population, like for jury duty. 2. They represent the general demographics of the population of a jurisdiction in terms of age, sex, social class, education, political orientation, and others deemed important. Education, political orientation, and others deemed important. 3. Candidates are screened for their capacity to serve competently and fairly. 4. Organizers divide the assembly into groups of between 8 to 12 individuals and seated in circles. 5. Organizers present with objective information and evidence for all sides of the subject at hand. 6. The groups deliberate under guidance of facilitators or mediators, and experts are available to answer questions. 7. The full assembly returns to report group findings. Deliberations continue, groups may reconvene, and the convention meets in plenary session to reach conclusions that represent Rousseau's standard of general will. This often achieves consensus of public opinion of people who are informed on the matters at hand, evaluates evidence and arguments apart from their personal interests in the context of the common good. Sovereignty. Meanwhile, I return to sovereignty. Rousseau wrote this: sovereignty consists essentially in the general will for how to proceed productively if there is significant differences of interests and policies that persist after this process. Sovereignty. Meanwhile, I return to sovereignty. Rousseau wrote this: sovereignty consists essentially in the general will. It is the body of citizens acting together. We agree with Rousseau. However, that definition contrasts with how the word sovereign is usually understood. Merriam-Webster's first definition says this: sovereign. One such as a king possessing supreme political power or sovereignty. Our radical and modern vision of sovereign rests on consent of the governed from the Declaration of Independence. Again, that definition precludes autocratic power that limits civic freedoms. Also, there are the first three words of the Constitution, "We the people," which suggests that the population controls government rather than the states or the federal government. We insist on this point. The Constitution does not objectively describe sovereignty or political power. But if we step back, we see that the founders had no experience of judging political power, except through a monarch and the parliament of a self-serving imperial power exploiting the colonies. There were better examples from history, but the immediate problems of state for the founders were between the states. They deserve due credit for aptly solving those problems. The Constitution empowered federal government over the states and managed democracy. They restrained the centrifugal tendencies of the states and the volatile impulses of public opinion. They created a system of federal authority with minimal public representation and constitutional supremacy over the states. It worked for about 2 centuries. In the past half-century, it has begun to unravel. That was one hell of an achievement in political history. Rome lasted 1,000 years, but it went through centuries of imperial control and colonialization. Since then, history has moved more swiftly, but the United States has mimicked the same path. The better examples from history since Rome are few and involve city-states, not empires or especially continents. The founders were skeptical that tribal practices or those of city-states would work at a continental scale. Further, in those times, Rousseau's ideals of general will and popular sovereignty were romanticized village life, and not available at that time in any practical sense. No one had ideas how to achieve the outcomes he envisioned. There are procedures now to practice reasoned and informed deliberations among citizen jurors of a nation. Some countries are putting those practices to good effect now. We encourage the people of the United States to learn these procedures and test them in practice. We will develop this idea fully later. Meanwhile, we take a hard look at sovereignty. A hard truth of the sovereign. Carl Schmitt, a 20th century German philosopher, defined the sovereign in a different way. His definition is operationally clear and elegantly simple. He said that the sovereign is who declares a state of exception. He meant that the sovereign is who can say that normal governing is not sufficient and a state of emergency exception is necessary. Some exceptions are common sense, such as an emergency following a hurricane, tornado, or an earthquake. Those are acts of God. People agree about what we should do about them. There are other emergencies, such as the Great Depression of 1933, World War II, and the Korean War. The United States has been under one or more active national emergency declarations almost continuously since 1979. Many are sanctions on other nations and attract little public attention, but they illustrate how the state of exception can become normalized or routine. Our point is that these emergencies, or exception powers, rest exclusively with the executive branch of the U.S. government. This suggests that the executive branch, or the president, has become the unitary executive that many modern conservatives advocate as the rightful palace of U.S. political power. We reject that premise on many grounds. The Constitution assigns Congress with authority to declare war, but the president is the commander-in-chief of the military and the unitary executive. That is confusing enough. Then there is the question of what is a war and what is temporary military defensive or retaliatory action. The U.S. Constitution does not identify what or who is sovereign. Humans gravitate toward a single person or entity to hold ultimate authority to decide when a state of exception is justified. We suggest that the United States should take this question seriously under consideration. Who or what is the sovereign? Who declares Schmitt's state of exception? Is it Congress, the President, or the House of Representatives? Perhaps it should be a body of 100 citizen jurors who serve the nation for a year, that hears the best evidence and arguments for or against a question, and decides what we the people consider as our general will. I hope that what I have is not so radical as to defy consideration. I fear it may be so unlike how most Americans consider our political landscape that it is inconceivable. And now, my dear doctor, I yield the floor to your more practical insight and wisdom.
Speaking for myself, as a former delegate to the convention, I do not believe that we the people referred to the general population. I believe most of us regarded ourselves as the people, and we were a class of aristocrats and wealthy landowners, merchants and traders, who later became the elected officials and representatives of the United States. Our purpose here, with common sense, common good, is to create a government with institutions designed to facilitate reasoned and informed public opinion, or the general will of the people, to apply its appropriate weight to the sovereign powers and policies of the U.S. government. The practical application of these principles leads to self-government by the people of the United States. But we are just halfway through my review of foundational principles of the Constitution. Here we move from natural rights or highly abstract or ideals to applications of human rights as defined in the Bill of Rights and laws of the states and the nation. It is a second layer of foundational purposes. The preamble of the Constitution of the United States. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The preamble lists 6 purposes of the Constitution and the U.S. government. They are all critical in our opinions, but we find that the U.S. government is deficient in half of them. I will discuss each of the 6 in turn, then take a broader view. 1. Form a more perfect union. 2. Establish justice. 3. Ensure domestic tranquility. 4. Provide for the common defense. 5. Promote the general welfare. 6. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves. Constitutional purposes. The first purpose of the Constitution. 1. Form a more perfect union. This phrase might be interpreted that the work is done. As of 1787 we had a perfect union for eternity. That seems to be the attitude of many Americans today, but I predicted it would last a course of years, and Jefferson thought the U.S. government should be overturned by a cleansing revolution every generation. The constitutional delegates took it upon themselves to heed Paine's advice to begin the world over again, and followed the words of the Declaration to abolish the Articles of Confederation and to institute a new government. We hold no animosity toward the Constitution. We admire its achievements. It broke the mold of preceding centuries and began the world over again, serving as a model of new nations of freedom. After 1/4 of a millennium, 240 years, it is time the United States did that again. The second purpose. 2. Establish justice. The United States has developed comprehensive systems to govern its people. With federal, state, and local laws and ordinances, government is designed to control the people. But we believe that the Constitution no longer can hold government to account, as the factional duopoly Leviathan has become. We assert that it was an error to believe that a system of power as government can rule itself reliably. The elements of government are laws, and human beings who are each designed to justify decisions to advance personal advantage. This advances through coalitions and factions. These natural human trends require outside control, just like any human enterprise. The founders created some limits on government with separation of powers and the principles of checks and balances. However, that is only possible if the different branches are independent and defend their independence. This is not held in practice, and the branches have aligned in opposing purposes of ideologies, policies, and power. The people's option is to vote, but we have discussed that candidates are selected and managed by the factional party interests for power. A large majority of Americans distrust the federal government, but the prospect of our re-election is over 90%. Systems of accountability between citizens, government itself, and government officials are grossly imbalanced. We asked AI to compare the two systems by monitoring, detection, investigation, enforcement, prosecution, adjudication, sanctions, and citizen effects. I won't review them here, but you may pause to consider how unbalanced or asymmetrical the systems are. We advocate 2 new social institutions or systems, one that monitors, corrects, and improves government, and another that cultivates public participation in politics and promotes virtues among citizens and leaders alike. The second would serve the third purpose to ensure domestic tranquility. The third purpose is 3. Ensure domestic tranquility. Shays' Rebellion was front and center on the framers' minds during the convention. It was an armed revolt against state taxes by citizens who had supported the revolution for independence. It appeared that greater authority was necessary, as states were unable to collect taxes peacefully. In those times there were no disciplines to resolve disputes, though many acquired skills from experience. The government's role was to establish courts to resolve disputes, with no option for mediation or arbitration. The government was reactive and largely remains so today, although we now recognize proactive approaches to preserve and promote social cohesion. Governments then provide surveillance and enforcement, and courts to settle legal disputes, but essentially nothing is available to improve domestic relations and social cohesion toward a sense of general will. In fact, our government, in its present two-party duopoly, promotes and incentivizes conflict to its advantage. The federal government could create a Department of Domestic Tranquility, or provide grants to states to develop projects to promote citizens' assemblies to advise local, state, and federal government departments and agencies regarding budgets, priorities, legislation, and policies. Here I interrupt with another hard truth. Related to sovereignty is government control. Public consent can be achieved by strict restrictions on the freedoms of expression, for example. That kind of Leviathan control contradicts the foundational values of liberty and justice we stand to defend. Societies that cycle into opposing ideologies of righteousness and wickedness do not last 240 years. The United States is heading in that direction. The fourth purpose is 4. Provide for the common defense. Provide for the common defense primarily refers to protecting the nation from threats by foreign powers, not to defending factions of Americans from one another. Throughout American history, however, the meaning of common defense to justify foreign military intervention has reached far beyond our borders. During the Cold War, the U.S. frequently took military action against communist governments to protect strategic allies that might be autocratic and to defend economic interests abroad. Then, following the attacks of September 11, 2001, American military operations were justified to prevent future terrorist threats before they reached American interests. What principles should guide American foreign policy? Should the United States primarily support governments that embrace constitutional self-government, civil liberties, and the rule of law? Or should strategic, economic, and security interests take precedence, even when allied governments employ illiberal or authoritarian methods? The question remains unsettled. Americans continue to debate whether national security is best served by consistently promoting Republican principles abroad, or by forming pragmatic partnerships with governments whose values may differ substantially from our own. I have posed more questions than I have clarified. I conclude that these questions deserve public deliberation to help determine national purposes. The fifth purpose, 5, promote the general welfare. Welfare is a general enough concept before we add general to it. However, in general, I say that the nation invests heavily into many programs to this end. With a great variety of agencies dedicated to health, education, agriculture, justice, interior, commerce, labor, transportation, energy, and security. However, our earlier comments about efforts to secure a harmonious or tranquil society with programs of civic education and democratic participation would apply here too. And last, number 6. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The history of the United States shows how liberty can contribute to some banes as well as blessings. I refer again to freedom of expression and the press. Americans are relatively free when considered in historical and global terms. Americans today enjoy freedoms none of us could imagine in our time. That is, industry, machines, electrical power, and fossil fuels are not modern by today's standards, but they provide enormous human freedom, security, convenience, and comfort in the developed world. At the risk of repeating this point too often, I say again, our national government and many state and local governments do more to promote the banes of liberty we mentioned, and little to nothing in the way of blessings of liberty. The incentives of our political parties are all aligned to promote conflict and display efforts to curtail the vile intentions of the other side. So far, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights has kept Americans largely free in terms of government restrictions on speech, religion, association, and other domains. However, there have been, and continue to be, strong biases against some economic and political ideologies, such as communism and socialism. Also, some groups focus on further marginalizing a minuscule portion of our populations that is sexually divergent. They seem to regard efforts to allow them freedom of self-expression as a threat to their safety or sanctity. It seems to me that no one deliberately decides what provokes their sexual preferences. I never gave it a second thought. Of course, my preferences were aligned with society's but not those of my wife. But that is another story. Economic liberty and opportunity have flourished in the Republic. Corporations have become so vast, wealthy, and powerful, I fear that opportunities for individual innovation and industry may be consumed by colossal organizations. Social and political information is tailored and targeted to individuals based on huge quantities of personal data gleaned from them. This undermines prospects for civil dialogues, mutual understanding, and meaningful compromises. Americans increasingly view political opponents not as fellow citizens, but as enemies. Can freedom of expression survive when citizens no longer tolerate others' right to disagree? Liberty is not endangered only by ambitious rulers. It is endangered when citizens abandon the habits required to sustain it. Those habits have not existed during the lifetimes of almost every American today. They involve civil political conversations that allow identifying the general will of the society and the capacity for self-government and consent of the governed. Should there be more constitutional purposes? We have implied how some of the existing constitutional purposes might be altered or expanded. However, many interests over 240 years have suggested others should be added. We will list 6 and say a few words about some. 1. Environmental interests and climate concerns prompt many to suggest a constitutional purpose be to preserve and restore the natural systems upon which life, liberty, and prosperity depend for ourselves and our posterity. 2. Preparation to participate in self-government. The government should cultivate knowledge, skills, and civic virtues necessary for Republican self-government. This was John Adams' suggestion to our committee, and we have embraced it. 3. Control of corporate monopolies and power. We do not address this huge problem here. 4. Promote integrity and validity in public media. This is a huge epistemological crisis in American today that we will address later in our ideas to expand the House of Representatives and substantially increase public participation in political discourse. 5. Assure justice in defining election districts and democratic principles in elections. Nearly 2/3 of Americans agree that the Electoral College is undemocratic. It is a remnant of allocating more power to states than the people. 6. Promote representative public deliberation democracy in determining general will. That is to ensure informed and reasoned public opinion receives due consideration in determining modern foundational principles of the Constitution. 2 recent examples of public contradiction include Citizens United in 2010 and Dobbs v. Jackson, Women's Health Organization, concerning abortion in 2022. Firearms registration is another area of popular disagreement, where a majority supports greater accountability, but a minority interest controls judicial decisions. This discussion has exceeded what all of us expected. It astounds me to contemplate what we have exposed, what our future may become. To adopt Paine's claim that we have it in our power to change the world over again is dumbfounding and overwhelming, yet it is necessary. To contemplate where the United States is heading is frightening, agonizing, and disheartening. That is proof that we must take action to open a path to a better future, a better government, and to show the world again how it can be done. Paine said he has done it before. I only hope we can help him do it again. Avery, please help me close this agonizing episode.
Well, thank you, Dr. Franklin. So in closing, I want to comment that most Americans believe, I believe most Americans will find what we present here and what we will present here are radical. But we resist that in terms of scholarly and historical perspectives of political philosophers and historians. They agree with what Franklin has just said about limitations with the Constitution. There's, when it comes to the scholars and experts and historians, we're basically mainstream with what we're saying. What makes our case unusual, I believe, is that our group dares to offer solutions. And we haven't described those yet, we will next. But when we consider these solutions and we stop to look at it, we say, yeah, they are radical. Maybe our analysis isn't, but what we think has to happen in order to improve our circumstances, I don't know if it's radical, but it's broad, and very broad in terms of social change and constitutional change. So when we stop and consider it, we can't think of anything less striking than what we have in mind that has a respectable chance of getting the job done, of improving our political circumstances. So I want to say here, bless you, Franklin and Paine and Henry and Madam Arndt. You have all exhibited outstanding determination in presenting what Lincoln called our better angels of our nature. And I would like to close with Abraham's words. Thank you.
We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave, to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, and will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.